What's up guys, today I'm going to be giving you an updated video of the very first one I did on this channel, and that's what are the best pickleball paddles for spin. I've tested a significant number of paddles since last year and there's been quite a few changes. Before we get into it, I just want to make some clarifications from last year's video that will hopefully help you understand the data better. If you want to skip these clarifications and go straight to the top 10, then go to this timestamp. Many of you commented about how this test can't be accurate because of humans doing the test. And yes, I do agree actually that a human doing the test is not as accurate as a machine. But unfortunately, there's not nearly enough money in the pickleball YouTube space to build a machine dedicated just to spinning a pickleball. So maybe one day it'll be big enough for me to build a machine, but until then, you guys are stuck with me. Last year, people also really got hung up on which paddles were ranked number 3 or number 5 or number 7 or whatever. People focused on the small placement changes, and I want people to know that the individual rankings do not matter nearly as much as the category placement. Last year, I said anything under 1200 RPM was low tier, anything between 1200 and 1500 was average, and then everything above 1500 was high tier. After a year of testing new paddles, that still holds true today. The reason I say you should focus on the tiers is because if a paddle is number 4 at 1710 RPM and number 3 is 1730, that 20 RPM difference does not matter at all. In fact, that 20 RPM difference could just be the human error portion of this test. The whole idea behind this test is to give you a rough ballpark of how good or bad a paddle is when it comes to spin, and that's why I think you should focus on whether it's in the low tier, average tier, or high tier. Because you're never gonna have a paddle, at least in my experience so far, that goes from low tier all the way up to high tier out of the blue. So yes, while there are things that could be improved in this test, I think it does give you a good idea of letting you know which paddles are bad for spin and which ones are good. Many of you have also asked me about 2 paddles in my testing that I've done previously. That's the Engage Encore MX 6.0 and the Engage Pursuit MX 6.0. Yes, these are 2 different paddles, even though they have incredibly similar names. A lot of you have commented and mixed these paddles up and wondered why in one video I said one thing and in another video it was completely different. The Encore last year had a very high result for my brother, but was very low for me. Unfortunately, in this last year, I haven't been able to get a brand new one to do a retest and figure out what was going on there. Now for the Engage Pursuit, many of you have asked me why it's so low in my spin test, even though it's using one of those raw carbon fiber surfaces. Honestly, I think Engage just has some grit consistency issues. For my Engage versus carbon versus Electrum video, I had myself and my 2 brothers retest the Engage EX and MX, and both were oddly low in the retest. Now, to be fair, both of those paddles were used, and these days I only test new paddles because I don't want the grit being worn down to have an effect on the RPM number that is put inside of my spreadsheet. I did get a brand new EX and MX to do some tests myself, and the results were much higher, coming in around 1500 plus. The reason I say there may be some consistency issues in the grit with Engage is I took a stare at SR160 on about 8 different brand new Engage Pursuit paddles, and the grit levels varied quite a bit. The legal RZ limit is 30 and the legal RT limit is 40. I saw RZ numbers range from as low as 18 and as high as 28 on 2 different Engage paddles. And yes, that is an average of both sides of the paddle. So I do 6 tests on one side and then 6 tests on the other, and then average those together. And on one paddle, the average was 18, and on another one, it was 28. For RT, I saw as low as 27 and as high as 38. That is a giant variance in grit level between these paddles, so perhaps the paddles I tested last year had the grit worn down, or just from the manufacturer, the grit levels weren't very high to begin with. I've also tested 20 plus other paddles and did not see this level of variance in the grit. Engage was the only brand to have a big variation. Also, to clarify, yes, I researched how to use the Starrett properly, I followed all of USAP's guidelines, and I made sure my Starrett was calibrated, and I verified with 2 manufacturers that I was using the device correctly. But who knows? The Starrett really isn't a perfect device to measure grit level, so it's too hard to say what could be the actual cause in those spin numbers being so different on Engage paddles. Alright, let's talk about the top 10 paddles for spin. There are always new paddles coming out that I'm trying to make sure get added to the list, so after you watch this video, make sure to go check out my Pickleball paddle stats spreadsheet to see the latest news on which paddles are performing well. There are a few paddles I still need to add to the list for this year, and those are the new Kennex Pro Spin, the new approved carbon models, and the new textured CX11 and 14 gearbox paddles. So if you want to see how those rank in the coming weeks, make sure to check the spreadsheet out. In the number 10 spot, we have the Kennex Pro Flight coming in at 1620 RPM. This paddle has been one of the most surprising to me because it does lack a gritty texture. I even retested the paddle recently and was still doing 1600 plus RPM. One of the reasons I think it performs so well, at least for me, is due to the very thin profile and having a low swing weight, which means I can generate a lot of paddle head speed to brush up on the ball. The Kennex Pro Flight is the lowest swing weight paddle I have tested out of my collection of about 80 to 90 paddles so far. In 9th, we have the Omega Evolution Max coming in at 1624 RPM. This is a great thing to see because the Omega line by Engage is on the cheaper side of paddles, and now they have top tier spin performance. I haven't gotten to spend extensive time testing these paddles, but I was really happy to see a paddle under 150 performing so well. In 8th, we have a paddle company that most of you probably haven't heard of, and that's Dink, or DINGK. Their Carbon Fiber Pro GRIX Green scored 1624 RPM, just like the Omega Evolution Max. I've hit this paddle a little bit now, and to be honest, it really isn't anything different than any of the other raw carbon fiber paddles. It feels about the same as any of the other ones I've used, so it's nice, just nothing different. In 7th, we have the Hyperion CAS 16 coming in at 1648 RPM. And this one was shocking to me how well it performed. I even redid the test on this paddle because I really didn't expect it to perform that well based on the grit texture that's on the face. The grit levels from the Starrett meter also weren't very high either. But even after a retest, it still performs near the top, so that's awesome to see. In 6th, we have the Gearbox CX14H coming in at 1692 RPM. Despite their lack of grit last year, the Gearbox CX line of paddles have consistently scored very high in my tests, and I can only imagine their new grit versions perform even better, so I'm very eager to see how those perform when I get them. In 5th, we have the SLK Omega Max coming in at 1700 RPM. Similarly to the Omega line by Engage, it's fantastic to see these cheaper paddles having such high tier performance. The SLK Omega Max doesn't feel gritty, but it acts similar to the Gearbox or Power Air, where clearly they've figured out some other ways of achieving spin outside of grit alone. In 4th, we have another Omega paddle, and that's the Evolution Elite. This came in at 1717 RPM, and one of the reasons I think it's higher than the Evolution Max is the same reason the Kennex does so well. The paddle is very thin with no edge guard, and it has a very low swing weight. So again, it's very easy to generate paddle head speed to brush up on the ball faster. Now for our final 3, if you've kept up with my channel recently, then you know that Selkirk has taken over this list. Last year, their Vanguard paddles performed incredibly poorly, but with the addition of their Labs paddles, they've gone to the highest tier of spin. In 3rd, we have the Selkirk Labs Project 003 coming in at 1740 RPM. In 2nd, we have the former king of spin, the Selkirk Labs Project 002 at 1800 RPM. And finally, in 1st place, we have the new king, and that's the Vanguard Power Air coming in at 1851 RPM. All 3 of these paddles are using the same textured coating, so it's no surprise that all of them perform exceptionally well. Many of you asked me recently if these paddles are just way over the grit level, and I checked them with the Starrett, and all of them were well below the legal limit, which is pretty shocking since a lot of raw carbon fiber paddles are right near the limit of what's legal, but aren't performing as well as these. So I don't know what Selkirk figured out, but clearly it's something really good to get spin. So as of September 2022, those are your top 10 best paddles for spin. Again, just remember that anything over 1500 is what I consider to be top tier spin. Don't get hung up on the Hyperion CFS only being 1584 and something like the Carbon Pro GRIX being 1624. In all reality, their spin potential is probably the same. The difference just may come down to swing weight, static weight, handle length, shape, and so on for each individual. Just because a paddle isn't in the top 10 doesn't mean it isn't fantastic for spin. So now before we wrap up this video, I just want to give you guys a walkthrough of how to use my spreadsheet. Right here, we just have a description. This is where I just put some information that I think is useful if you are a first-time viewer of the spreadsheet. And then if you scroll down here, you will see all of the data. So right now we are on the master tab, and this just gives you all of the information that I put inside of the spreadsheet. So right here, you have the company, it's filtered in alphabetical order. Then you've got the paddle model, what face material the paddle is using, the price, grip length, core material, core thickness, grip thickness, shape, RPM for spin, the average weight range of the paddle, swing weight if I have it. There are paddles in here from my very first spin test when I got a ton of loaner paddles. So I don't have those anymore, and that's why you won't see the swing weight. I put in notes if there's anything worthy to note, either grit wearing off over a certain amount of time, or maybe it's using paint grit, or just some other note about the paddle. Then you've got the YouTube review if I have a YouTube review of the paddle, and then a link to purchase the paddle. These are just affiliate links to just paddles, so I get a small kickback if you guys purchase something from there. So that's there. But then we also have these tabs with different views that I've built for you guys for easier sorting. So if we go over to the RPM tab, you'll see now it's just the paddle company, the paddle, and then the RPM. So if you don't need all of the other information and you just want to know what's the best paddle for spin, then you can go through here. Then we have RPM by company, so it'll group it based on the company. So if we go down to like Engage here, you can see what Engage's best spinning paddle is. Gearbox, got the CX14H, and then go down. So yeah, easy way to sort. Also, the ones that have groups, you'll notice that it doesn't have all the brands. You actually have to show 10 more groups, if that'll load. And then if I scroll down again, actually this time it did load all of them. But yeah, this can be an easy way to see RPM by the different brands. We have RPM by face material. So if you wanted to know like, okay, how does composite stack up? The best composite spinning paddle that I've tested was the Head Radical Tour Co. Here are carbon fiber. There are some blends in here, stuff like that. Swing weight. If you want to see the swing weight, there is more stats in here because I think grip length and weight are good information to understand when you are talking about swing weight, because if you have an 8.5 ounce paddle and a longer handle, typically the longer the handle length is, the higher the swing weight of the paddle is going to be because the head is further away from your hand. So that's why I left that in there. But as you can see, there's a ton of different tabs that you can go through. So now let's talk about some sort and filter options you have with my spreadsheet. So if you come over to sort, you can sort by a number of different things. So let's say we want to sort by price. Now we are sorting by lowest to highest price. So if I wanted to change this to descending, now I can see the most expensive paddle on here. And then if I scroll down, it will get cheaper and cheaper. And then if you don't want that filter anymore, you can come over here and delete that sort. Now filtering, you can do some pretty cool stuff. So let's say I wanted to create a filter, and then let's say we want to filter by RPM, and then we'll say, you can do a handful of different things. So you could say RPM is greater than 1600, and now it will only show you paddles that have an RPM of 1600 or higher. And then if you wanted to get really fancy, you could create another filter. Let's say we wanted to do handle length because you want a two-hand backhand and you want to have high spin. So then we could come over to grip length, and then we could do contains 5.5. And so right here, 1600 RPM and a 5.5 inch handle. That shows the non-approved carbon 13 millimeter and the Yola Hyperion CAS 16 millimeter. So let's say if we change this to 5.25. Now we've got just 3 paddles: the Vanguard Power Air, the Selkirk Labs Project 003, and the Selkirk Labs Project 002. If we wanted to change this one more time, we could even do 5-inch handle. Now we've got the SLK Omega Max, Evolution Max, and the Elite. So you can get a little creative with your own filtering options if there's something I haven't already built in here. So if there's a view that you guys want to see regularly that I haven't already pre-built, just let me know down in the comments and I would be happy to add it. I want to make sure that this spreadsheet is easy to use and get the information that you are looking for as quickly as possible. And then once you guys are done with your filtering options, you can go ahead and click them and then just delete filter. This only does it for your view. It doesn't affect anyone else's view. And then we're back to the master tab. And if you wanted to go over to something else like RPM by swing weight, then you can go over there and see that. So yeah, that's all there is to my spreadsheet. Hope you guys enjoy it. And yeah, so thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.